Okay, my timeline starts in 1950 um, with the post-war depression coming to a close. The depression had a massive influence on popular music um, for the past 5 years, and we continue to for a few more. And it was just reinforcing the blues sort of aspect of poverty. It was poverty and essentially poverty. Um, the Les Paul invents the first commercially available electric guitar. That was in 1952, and that influenced a whole swath of music. Influenced all of music forever after. Um, and BB King and BB King, Chuck Berry, and Muddy Waters were the first sort of pioneers of the electric guitar. They they popularised it, and it was mainly used for playing blues. Um, and it was a lead instrument, and um, and it helped bring lead guitar lines into the front, and that would eventually result in things like guitar solos and all sorts of things, and everything. Overdrive and psychedelic rock was couldn't have existed without the electric guitar. So that was a very influential phase. Um, but that wouldn't have been, or perhaps it wouldn't have happened with such gusto, I guess, without the Fender Stratocaster, because the Fender Stratocaster became an instant cultural icon thanks to the Shadows, Hank Williams, I think, and the Shadows. The Shadows appeared in a black and white video. Well, it was completely black and white, apart from one red Fender Precision bass and two red Fender Stratocasters, and that video influenced everyone from Bob Dylan to Mark Knopfler to Pink Floyd, you know, and it's a video. So that was massive. That influenced music hugely. These two electric guitars being commercially available. They were very expensive in the beginning, but soon after replicas were being made here, there, and everywhere. So everyone had an electric guitar sooner or later. The Beatles formed around the beginning of mid 50s to 1960s, and they would also influence popular music to a huge extent. They started off as a blues cover band and an early rock cover band. So they were covering the Shadows and Chuck Berry. So Chuck Berry John Lennon was quoted as saying, if rock and roll could be said in another word, it would be Chuck Berry. So that was very influential. Chuck Berry was very influential to the Beatles, and the Beatles were very influential to everyone. Vietnam was happening. Jimi Hendrix refuses to be drafted, while Elvis doesn't. Elvis inspires a whole generation of American youth to go to war and fight what's essentially a pointless war, which is definitely a bad thing in hindsight. But anyway, rock and roll. As I said, Chuck Berry and the Shadows, and that was the sort of start of rock and roll. Rock and roll was born out of a sort of mix of blues, folk, gospel, jazz, country. They all sort of came together, and when the electric guitar sort of was its fuel, and that all sorts of new sounds happened, and that was how that happened. LSD, beginning of the 60s, lysergic acid diethylamide. That was a huge influence for psychedelic rock, as well as marijuana, and that became massive. And Bob Dylan was a huge folk phenomenon. He'd been influenced by Woody Guthrie massively by Woody Guthrie. He was a huge folk. Well, not huge. He was a fairly large folk hero in America, sort of the Bleecker Street sort of scene, um, and and then Bob Dylan obviously became huge, massive, um, with all his folk, with his folk songs, influenced loads of young people to get into folk rock, and then and then middle of the '60s, '65, Dylan goes electric, and that was a big thing as well. I mean that sort of that swayed a lot of people, made a lot of people very angry. There's lots of recordings of Dylan gigs where half the audience are booing. They'd come just to boo because he'd gone electric. They considered him a traitor to the folk movement, which is interesting because the music wouldn't exist without progression. So there was a bit of a contradiction in terms, but I suppose they were just upset because he was a folkie. Lots more racial integration during the 60s for popular music. I mean, Jimi Hendrix was one. I mean, B.B. King. B.B. King wasn't a massive popular figure. I mean, he was pretty big, but didn't get not as big as Jimi Hendrix. And Stevie Wonder and Sam Cooke also they helped pioneer the sort of the integration of black music into mainstream popular culture, which is a very good thing because without black music, music would be crap. Flower Power, the hippie movement, that was very much tied in with the Beatles and their influence on the USA, and then the UK and then the USA. And that was cool. There was Woodstock where Jimi Hendrix played and all that stuff kicked off. And there was the Mini Moog synthesizer, which sort of brought around loads of new sounds. The Mini Moog synthesizer was late '60s, and that was quickly snapped up by it was used in the White Album, and it was used by Pink Floyd. So I'll go back and '65, Beach Boys, surf rock was great for California, and that was influenced just mainly by rock and roll and just the sound that area of America seemed to get, which that was an interesting sound. The Velvet Underground were very much sort of from New York, and they were very much drugs orientated, and incredible musicians with very interesting ideas. Lou Reed was particularly abhorrent to the media, and the mainstream did not like the Velvet Underground or Lou Reed. I mean, obviously they were massive, they were huge, but they did not get popular reviews from any sort of newspapers or anything. So that was sort of, it wasn't the beginning of it, but it was part of the separation between youth and the youth of the day and the adults. It became two separate things, and there became lots of tension between the old and the young. The old didn't. I mean, like with the Fender Stratocaster, it had the vibrato arm, the tremolo arm, which people who'd sort of grown up when that came about didn't like that sound at all, but everyone after who hadn't grown up with it loved it. It was this crazy sort of, although little sound, little addition to this huge part of it. So all sorts of separation between the youth and the old. The first facelift happened in the beginning of the '70s. That was it didn't really influence music much, but it influenced culture, and it was the beginning of that sort of the very materialistic sort of I suppose sort of just materialistic, and also there was lots of money in the music industry. So music